Hi, I'm Britt Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future.
This is, unfortunately, the final episode of our 4th season. And, it's been another exciting, wide-ranging sprint through some really diverse topics. We've covered everything from genetic diversity of bananas and lions to
Yes.
the fight against Pharaoh's curse and even the underappreciated beauty of Mr. Blobby. Oh, it has been so good.
And if all of that sounds confusing, it means that you haven't yet had the chance to listen to the other 5 episodes of this season. If you're intrigued, then we invite you to roll back the clock and indulge in some more nature insight.
Indeed. But as we are on this final episode and come to the end of this season, it is perhaps appropriate or even poetic, which tells you a little more about what we have in store for this episode, that we talk about endlings.
Even the word itself, Britt, there's an echo of pathos and sadness to it, but the reality of what endlings are is tragic.
Yes, endlings describe the last individual of an entire species before it becomes extinct. They are quite literally the end of the line, the biological equivalent of closing the door on the existence of the countless others that came before them. The last of their kind that will ever exist. It's really this massive topic and concept. Now, there are famous and poignant examples. Think about Martha, the last passenger pigeon who died in 1914. Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise whose life ended in 2012 in the Galapagos. Another George, the final member of a snail species in Hawaii that died out in 2019. And, Sudan, the world's last male northern white rhino, which you might have remembered, died 6 years ago in Kenya.
Sadly, Britt, although extinctions do occur naturally, the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019 found that the current rate of extinction is tens to hundreds of times greater than the normal background rate of extinction. So, in other words, 10 to hundreds of times greater than what it would be without our impact, the impact of human activity on the other species that share our world. The headline finding of that IPBES report was that at least 1 million species of plants and animals now face extinction, many of those within decades. So the terrible truth is, we may need to prepare for many more endlings in our own lifetimes.
And to really understand what extinction means, it's important to consider and understand the endlings that we have lived alongside and then lost. There are many scientists who are trying to record as much as possible about these species literally before it's too late. And one of those involved in this difficult task is Dr. Alexander Lees from the University of Manchester in the UK. His area of research is birds, and when I spoke to him, he told me about his experiences and the challenges in charting threatened and dying species.
A big part of my research career has been undertaken in Brazil, which is a super hyper-diverse country. I was based for 5 years at the Geldi Museum in the eastern Brazilian Amazon. In 2012, I attended the Brazilian Ornithology Congress at Maceió in Alagoas. And in the run-up, because I'm also a bird watcher as well as an ornithologist, myself and my wife planned to visit some of these fragments to see some of these super, super rare birds. One of those species was called Alagoas foliage gleaner, which is one of a series of birds, new to science and discovered in the 1970s, all of which are sort of critically endangered, or at least endangered, only found in this tiny area in northeast Brazil. So I visited those forests prior to this conference. We spent a few days wandering around those forest fragments and failed to find the bird, and it later transpired that the last sort of reputable sighting of the bird was about 11 or 12 months prior to that. And there's always this hope, was this really the last individual that was hanging out there? And then subsequently to that, I was in a Brazilian Red List meeting, and we came to the collective decision that the species was likely extinct. So it was only ever known from 2 small forest patches, so sort of quite haunting to wander around those patches, trying to find this species which had been so recently there. So we're sort of starting to see a wave of extinctions of species in northeast Brazil, whereas historically most species of birds going extinct have been on islands globally. And although that loss of forest has played out over a long time. It's only now that what we call the extinction debt, so these losses are starting to play out. So incredibly worrying. And there were probably other extinctions that happened within the same region which are unknown to science because, there's been no vestiges of those species have remained.
You mentioned being with specialist group declaring some of these species extinct. What does that feel like?
Horrendous. And denial as well, I guess. As soon as that bird, as soon as the Brazilian Red List Authority declared that species extinct, obviously there was a party sent out to look for it. People thought, well, surely they've jumped the gun here. But we were pretty certain, and, it's now been, 12 years and no one has seen that bird again. The mood in the room there was awful. It was terrible to be the people saying, well, we think this is lost. And it seemed crazy, even to do that within 2 years. But people have been searching for this bird for decades. It had only been known from 2 sites. It disappeared from one of them, disappeared from the other one. And then we could be pretty confident that it had gone. So incredibly sobering and incredibly sad, really.
It's always striking to me that the people who typically care about these things the most are up against the hardest news. So you all were gathered there on account of loving this, both intellectually, scientifically, and also personally. And yet it's those people that then have to make these calls that are so difficult.
Indeed. And the people involved in this weren't just professional ornithologists. They were also regional bird guides who know the avifauna very well. A guy called Ciro Albano, who was probably had more field experience of that bird than anyone else.
Extinction debt, this concept that you mentioned, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, extinction debt is the idea that it can take a while for species to disappear. A species could be committed to extinction simply because they're not breeding fast enough or they're not breeding at all. But in some cases, the individuals may be quite long-lived birds, or in the case of, a very, very long-lived tortoise. So it's just there's no longer viable populations. There's no evidence that we're even able to reverse those declines without, for instance, captive breeding. And there's even a challenge there that we don't necessarily have the know-how to captive breed many of these species. I mean, up until very recently, no one had the know-how to keep things like antbirds or foliage gleaners alive.
And how do we quantify the many more? How many could be out there?
If you've reached the point of the last individual, it's either a species we've studied very well or it's a species which is entirely unknown to science. And essentially those are entirely unknowable. And even if it's a species we suspect is a last individual, there's always a reticence amongst conservation biologists to commit what's been called the Romeo error. So that mistake of assuming that a species is extinct or assuming it's the last individual, at which point, investing precious conservation resources in conservation of a species would be worthless. And so there's always a risk that there might be more, and we should keep looking, for birds, which is a taxonomic group which I study. We have reasonable data on many species. So a good example might be the Mauritius kestrel, which ended up with just 4 individuals remaining, and some, ornithologists and ecologists were sort of ready to sign the death papers for that bird and say, well, we should stop investing in this because it's definitely going to go. But because it's a kestrel, and because obviously we had this as a species, we've been captive breeding birds of prey for a very long time. There's all this falconry knowledge that species was turned around and dramatically increased to being a population of hundreds in the 1990s. Although sadly since then the species has started declining again, is now globally endangered.
You mentioned taxonomic groups, so different kind of categories of species, and that we know a lot about birds. And in fact, birds are some of the most famous endling examples. What are some taxonomic groups that we might be missing?
Almost any other, right? I mean, the famous IPBES assessment hypothesized that perhaps 1 million species were threatened with extinction, and a vast majority of those species are unknown. So ultimately, we have a very poor handle on just how many species of animals and plants out there, and the majority of animals are invertebrates, and we've only described a relatively small number of them.
So there are likely far more lonesome Georges the snail than the tortoise, it appears.
Absolutely.
What are some of the consequences of extinction when we look at systems? Are there some striking examples that come to mind in terms of the effect?
Well, I guess a classic example would be the island of Guam in the Pacific. So there was an accidental introduction of a predator in the sort of post-war years there, a species called the brown tree snake. And this species basically ended up causing the direct extinction of almost all of the native forest birds on the island of Guam. All those species were lost. And then the entire ecosystem fundamentally changed, become this sort of spider-dominated, arachnophobes' worst nightmare ecosystem. And then cascading impacts across remaining species, issues with other introduced species there as well. So the end product of extinction, in many cases, can be quite catastrophic. In others, perhaps less so. There is functional redundancy in nature, but there's also obviously incredibly important ethical considerations that we probably shouldn't be here only trying to judge a species on the merit of some major ecosystem service it can deliver.
I think you're absolutely right to mention just the intrinsic value of something being there and then it not anymore. Loss is loss, and that has importance as well. When you work with extinction within fields related to loss, where is there hope, or where is there the future?
I guess there's two parts to this. I think there's always room for conservation optimism. There are always stories about the species like the Mauritius kestrel, which have almost knocked on the door of extinction and been returned because, if we invest in conservation, it does work. California condor is another one in that example, a species which, had a vast amount of time and resources and conservation action invested in it, incredibly successful. I think there's also the importance in recognizing the challenge that we have as conservation biologists in being able to talk about loss of ecosystems. Now, a lot of my work within the remit of the Sustainable Amazon Network is about major changes in the Amazon basin in terms of carbon storage or climate change or declines and change in species communities. And it's very difficult to talk to people and often journalists about these sorts of changes because people identify with individuals. And, in that way, Endlings are individuals. There's hope here in Endlings. It's using them as sort of, one journalist put it as avatars of extinction, right? It's trying to capture people's interest with these species, drive some discomfort, I guess, amongst them that we don't want to be in this position, and then take solace in the fact that conservation does work when applied and when supported.
Britt, I can't imagine the kind of toll it must exact on you if you're a scientist or a conservationist and you've spent years of your life, possibly decades of your life, trying to protect or conserve a species and then having to declare that species extinct.
Yeah, I don't think our brains are really wired to actually understand that. It's sort of too big. It's too deep of a thing. And the consequences also, the Romeo error. What if they aren't? And then you've actually moved resources, time, and commitment away from potentially bringing something back from the brink.
One of the things that stood out for me in that interview with Alexander was his description of the kinds of impact that an extinction actually can have on an ecosystem. It's been, I think, quite academic to me until I heard that example. This idea that the introduced brown tree snake, the invasive alien species in Guam, and the elimination of those snakes of the bird species, leading to spiders dominating that ecosystem and essentially taking over and becoming the primary predators. The cascading impacts of an extinction and what that can mean for all of the other species sharing that geographical area.
Yes, there are many of those examples, but I will say what I took from it is the fact that we do have that room for optimism. We have seen these species, knocking at the door of extinction and then coming back with help from people, with help from the same group that may have put them into harm or threat in the first place.
The Californian condor example.
Exactly. Yep. Mauritian kestrel. Exactly.
So taking that idea that there is hope, there is room for conservation optimism, how can conservation then be reinforced? And the idea of linking to the ideas that we had in the episodes that we did earlier this season about the Nexus and the transformative change reports that IPBES is working on. Can we find ways of tackling the problems of extinction while tackling some of the other big challenges that we're working on, whether that's health challenges or water or agriculture or climate change challenges? and in ways that are going to be really transformative, not just incremental in the way that we change things, but really tackling things at the level of underlying causes, behaviors, values, the drivers that perhaps are less obvious to us.
And perhaps we need that personal that sort of guidance and opening to really care and connect. And Endlings might be that thing, kind of avatars of extinction. We can drive action because of discomfort. Even though we are upset, it actually lets us move forward. We can take hope from the examples of extinction avoided and see how we can use that to mobilize action.
I think the interview is going to stay with me for a long time.
Yeah, me too. And, as we said, this concept in this situation, it is too big. It's just too big. And the beauty of something being too big is that we as humans can actually use maybe something not quite scientific to grapple with it and to deal with it and process it. And to me, that's actually where art comes in. The extent of this challenge is clear, and we want to save and preserve as much as possible. But again, even with these interventions, we do have extinctions of species, and this is inherently sad and poignant. And, how do we mark these passings? How do we deal with something this big?
So how does art help us do that?
Well, I'll tell you, we have an amazing person who's sort of helped us do exactly that. Joanna Lilly is a writer and poet originally from the UK, but who lives in the Yukon, which is a vast and sparsely populated territory in northern Canada. Her last volume of poetry, published in 2020, was actually called Endlings. She told me how she came to write poems about endlings and how she went about the task.
I sort of just started researching extinct species in a fairly random way. And then I started gathering some books. And then I would go to natural history museums and see what was there. And then I would try and find a connection with the species. Obviously, that wasn't difficult, but I had to sort of find the poem in their story or some emotional tug for me that drew me towards them in particular. And then I would write a lot of notes. I'd do little sketches. And if I was in a museum, stand in front of the species and write whatever was coming to me. And then come back to that in a more reflective space and see if I could develop a poem from that process.
Those moments sound really special. What are some examples of those species or individuals that spoke to you? You mentioned museums, for example. Are there moments that you can remember?
Yeah, there were some particular moments, one of them being in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. Yeah, I walked into one of the galleries and I could see a skeleton hanging from the ceiling, and I immediately recognized it as a Steller's sea cow, which unfortunately didn't survive for many years after we discovered the Steller's sea cow. And when I say we, I should really identify, I'm talking about Europeans, not indigenous peoples. They were in the Bering Straits area, and so Europeans were using them for food as they were exploring and traveling for the fur trade and so on. And they're just remarkable giant creatures and very passive, I suppose. And they also had a strong sense of community and loyalty, much like we do to our families and so on. It was huge, even though the gallery itself was huge. It seemed giant. I'm not a scientist in any sense, so I was very pleased with myself when I looked up and I immediately recognized the skeleton, and I felt very emotional. I was teary, being an emotional poet sort of person. So I just stood there and did some sketches and just sort of communed, as it were, with this beautiful creature.
I like how you mentioned just being an emotional poet, responding emotionally. I have the exact same process, though, even as someone working in the sciences. When you see these things, I don't know that it really is anything other than emotional. And I wonder for you, is poetry and this form of storytelling part of the grieving process in a way? Is this part of your process of coping with these realities?
Yes, I think absolutely. I've sort of worried about animals all my life. I can't remember a time when I didn't. I had all this climate grief and extinction stress and all these things that we are dealing with. So yes, it's like, how do you deal with all of that? And I'm grateful I have poetry. It felt an honor, really, to be able to spend time with these species and then create something.
That also makes me think about the balance and these lines with art and writing within such dismay and anxiety and grief. Where is the hope? Like, is there something positive or beautiful to be found within the act of saying goodbye? Where is that hope for you, for example?
That's really beautifully put. Yes, I think there is hope by paying attention, and it might be too late, as it were, for these species. But I hope by paying attention, we can consider other species differently or have that sense of how precious they are. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that extinction is very natural. I think something like 99% of all species become extinct or will become extinct. We've had 5 mass extinction events that we're aware of. So about half of the poems are about species that became extinct because of humans, and then about half are about species who existed before we came along. So I think we have to bear that in mind too. It's complicated, hey? And I think, yes, the poetry, the writing, the stories helps us get our heads around all of this and find a way through it.
Extinction is such a big thing. It's almost too big. In fact, it is too big to deal with in any one way or one discipline. So I'm so inspired by knowing that we can approach it from scientific perspectives and from artistic perspectives and let these both inform each other, because sometimes the scientific facts don't actually get us all the way there. We need art. Would you be willing to share something, a piece from your book, Endlings, with us?
Yes, of course, that would be an honor. Thank you very much. So I'll read the first part of a poem called The Last Labrador Duck. And this species, very ordinary duck, really. But what caught my attention is that we know exactly when and how this species became extinct. And it was on the 12th of December in 1878 in Elmira in New York State. A boy went out duck hunting and they were hungry. So you've got all these other factors, starvation and poverty and so on. And that intrigued me. And so I will read the first part of the poem. 13 days to Christmas. The boy's little sister is loudly hungry. His mother silently, bent at the apron strings. The boy goes to the river, wide with ice. He slips. His father's gun knocks his knee. The hawthorns are scratchy lines, as indecipherable to him as newspapers. He stops. There's a block of grubby snow on the sleek ice, brown and white, a noose of black. The ice creaks as the boy creeps close. The bird doesn't stir. Its eyes look closed. Until now, he's never wondered if birds sleep. The bill is orange at the base, the tip black as a bruised toe. He tugs a glove off with his teeth and raises the gun.
After 4 incredible seasons of interviews, Britt, that discussion that you just had with Joanna is one of the ones that I found most emotional and most remarkable. Did it impact you as deeply?
Oh, absolutely. In speaking to her, she mentioned, I'm not a scientist, that's not my specialty. That's sort of not my thing. But she is. This way of using art and poetry and words to explore the world around us. I mean, that is science in its own beautiful way. And to get her guidance taking us into this in a way that we don't deal with typically within science and policy was remarkably powerful. I'm just so thankful to have had her as a guide through this topic.
I think we need more poets and more artists on the show. Season 4 has really been a lot about these coping strategies, right? I mean, we've talked about so many different ways of approaching the environmental crises, from the transformative change that's needed, to using comedy and humor in our episode about ugly animals, and now to art and to poetry as part of the grieving process for species extinction, because these topics are too big to be dealt with in only one way.
Right. And there we are again, right? What IPBES does as far as interdisciplinary work, grabbing as many perspectives as possible, that includes as many tools as possible to actually deal with this massive thing we're up against as far as loss of life on Earth. And, human agency is key here.
Yeah, in both directions.
Yes, exactly. Negative and positive, right? We can destroy and we can also conserve life. With great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man might not have been about the biodiversity crisis, but it does have spiders? I don't know.
So we've had Star Wars in this season. We've had Guardians of the Galaxy. Spider-Man just made an appearance. Minecraft has had its moment. What for you was perhaps the most memorable, the most engaging moments that you like to think back on?
Right, besides our rampant use of pop culture, which, hey, our stand-up comedian evolutionary biologist, I think, would support us here.
Definitely approve. Yep.
Yes, totally. Honestly, that was kind of cool for me. I mean, look, I academically grew up within conservation genetics. It was just an absolute delight to get those perspectives and to think about genetic diversity not only as something, that we're losing, but rather this thing that we preserve as an insurance policy for the future.
Yeah. It's these ideas of analogies and examples and telling stories that help people understand some of these really big concepts that I think really makes such value out of the podcast and the episodes.
Mm-hmm.
For me, in the episode which we did about the concept of the nexus, and again, that's quite a complex, quite conceptual concept, and giving it that really human face of saying, well, we're using aquatic plants that we're taking out of polluted river courses, and we're using those plants to help fight a deadly disease through a nexus approach. I mean, it made it so much more real for me. So again, the examples and just really breaking things down.
Yeah, and speaking of examples, I will not ever forget 4-year-old hate mail. It's never leaving me, and I am thankful for that.
Well, we're not talking about hate mail that's 4 years old. We're talking about hate mail from 4-year-olds. And if you don't know what we're talking about, you haven't listened to all the episodes.
Gotta go back. It is very, very worth it. Yes, indeed. Much love to Mr. Blobby, forever protected by a group of very engaged 4-year-olds that will tell you to be kind. Which, hey, what better message for us, right?
Hate mail with love.
Classic.
What about some takeaways, apart from sort of the highlight moments? What have been some golden threads for you through the season?
Oh, absolutely the different approaches and disciplines. I just continue to be amazed by how wide the IPBES stakeholder network is. And I mean that in the best possible way. To hear from people who might be focused on economics, discuss what it means to be focused on poetry, to discuss what it is to be focused on DNA. I'm excited by this. I'm excited by the idea that everyone has a role to play.
Absolutely. And for me, one of the big takeaways from the season, we say it at the top of every episode. We say we're giving people a backstage pass. We're pulling back the curtain. But really, I think this season for me was about looking deeper, finding the beauty in the ugly, finding the value and the values in the complexity, scratching the surface and looking beyond something like the last of a species to find meaning, to find lessons that can be taken and optimism that can be drawn from that. Really going deeper.
Yeah, and storytelling lets us do that.
Yeah.
These hundreds of thousands of years of evolution for our species has led to that being just one of our most remarkable tools. And I was really inspired by those different ideas and versions of communication and public relation and storytelling in conservation science.
And all of this season has been happening against the background of some very big international discussions, negotiations, meetings.
Indeed.
The COPs that everybody talks about, whether it's the climate COP or the biodiversity COP, and IPBES's own version of a COP, the plenary session, which took place right in the middle of this season before we had the festive season break, where all of this science, all of this evidence that IPBES produces, particularly in the two new reports, the Nexus and the Transformative Change report, were really brought in front of the people who have to make the choices, make the decisions about policy and about nature and people.
It's all happening all the time, and it's just been lovely to be a small part of it. Sadly, that is it for this episode and for this season of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future. I'm Britt Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall. Planning and making these episodes is such a joy for us as presenters and as producers, but they're ultimately about each one of you, our listeners. Our hope is you enjoy them as much as we enjoy making them, and if you do, please tell your friends, tell your colleagues, tell your family about the series, and leave us a rating on any of the podcast platforms where you get your pods.
You can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of their social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. Thank you, Rob, so much for another amazing season.
No, thanks to you, Britt, and to you for listening. Until next time, on Season 5 of Nature Insight, bye for now.